We just had word that the thing is being recorded, Robert.
You did hear that?
No.
Yep, positively. I saw it and I hear it. Now I'm seeing a screen from Paul.
All right. This evening, ladies and gentlemen, our guests are the speakers from the previous 8 sessions. And the beginning of that, well, before getting into that, let me say thank you. I particularly want to say thank you to those of you that contributed to the Zoomathon. It's a remarkable thing that our Outreach International effort, which, by the way, Outreach International does contribute 100% of the funds gathered to the site for which they're directed. And we had the president of Outreach on the Zoomathon yesterday, and he pointed out that that the situation in Haiti is actually getting better in terms of life expectancy. Since 1990, they've added more than about 10 years to life expectancy of the people in Haiti, in spite of the hurricanes, the 200,000 people dead from the 2010 earthquake, another couple thousand dead from the earthquake this year, and then COVID taking its toll. But the fact that the conditions for life in Haiti, by and large, are improving is something that is rather defiant of the news that we keep getting for a country that is in pretty desperately sad situation. So I do want to especially thank those of you that have contributed. The Outreach International webpage remains open and available if you'd like yet to make a contribution, and it does not need to be tied to our project at all. You're welcome to put it in on the Philippines or any other country that you would choose, and just do it on your own, because the idea of being able to help people feed their children, have clean water, be able to educate their kids, these are fundamental driving principles behind the whole process. And I wanted to also highlight that I am so gratified as I look back upon the history of recent presentations to see the breadth and depth of research that's gone into them. And this evening, for example, we would begin with Jonathan Neville and his presentation on the Jonathan Edwards influence on Joseph Smith. And I'm intrigued because he showed the concept of infinite goodness some 55 times in the Book of Mormon. And I hadn't realized this was not in the Bible, but Jonathan Edwards, a century before Joseph Smith, used that concept. And then Neville also points out that there are about 750 words in the Book of Mormon that are not in the Bible, but that they are in the 8 volumes of Edwards, which would have been available to Joseph Smith in the Strong bookseller in Palmyra. And he had the interesting note that Joseph Smith had been daubed with ink because he was a nuisance sitting there reading the books all the time, which, as an interesting outcome of his 3 surgeries on his leg when he was 7, here he was still recuperating. He'd spent 3 years with his uncle Silas in Salem, but now here back home, he still wasn't fit to work on the farm, and so being able to go read clearly must have been a profound influence. And then Jonathan Edwards' influence on Joseph Smith appears to be showing up several hundred times in the Book of Mormon. Concepts like the worth of souls and the sting of death being swallowed up in Christ, a dog returning to his vomit, following the straight and narrow, and partaking of salvation. The whole concept of rights, human rights, the rights of people, something that is pioneered there. And so I really was profoundly moved by Jonathan Neville's presentation, because anytime that we can find historical connections that help us understand how Joseph Smith acquired the vocabulary that he used in translation, I think that is helpful. I normally put together a poetic prayer and just now realized I did not do that for tonight's session. And so just bow with me in prayer, if you would, please. Loving Father, creator of a beautiful, marvelous universe, orchestrated with all of the tiny and then the bigger and huger developments that you've created. We hear and we see the interaction of the birds, the worms, the buzzards, the whippoorwills, the mosquitoes, and the dragonflies that eat them, the seas and the beautiful underlying corals and fish, such a marvelous underworld universe. And we but glimpse a bit of your marvelous creation and are caused to sit in awe as we bow before you. And then we look at the stars and try to imagine what it is to be a light year, or even 1,000 light years away, and what remarkable creation there is in the multiverse around us. And so we can't help but be in awe. For given our three basic dimensions and the additional dimension of time, we find ourselves rather confined and unable to embrace a really good value of you. The awe that we have for you apparently has to have us reach beyond our dimensions in order to begin to embrace, to apprehend. And so, as the great I am, we look to you this evening and are grateful for the chance to be. We are honored to have been created by you, to find a place in this universe, and then to discover that you have purpose for us and would call us to seek out the truth, to seek out your kingdom, to seek to bring forward the kingdom that you have designed from the outset of history, that should be the community of Zion, where people can dwell together in righteousness and have no poor, no poverty among them. Father, we have a long ways to go. We recognize that, but we can also see that there are glimpses of the reality being brought to light, and we thank you for that, and we praise you for the guidance in history that brings that closer to truth. This evening, as we gather to review the last 8 presentations in the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum, we thank you for the blessings of these marvelous presenters who have done deep research, profound study, and have published to make it so that the world can better understand your awesome nature, and especially the nature of your awesome word. For as students of the Book of Mormon, we recognize that your word is to all people, to the other sheep, and to us as well. We thank you for it. We praise you for it. And again, we thank you for allowing us to participate in the beautiful universe that you've created and allowed us to be born into. Bless us, we pray, as we share together, that in our discussions we can appreciate each other's perspectives and continue to be brothers and sisters, building bridges across the chasms of our past toward the Zion of the future. Amen. Now then, Deb, I need to check back with you to find out if we have Jonathan, if Jonathan has come in, or if not, we'll go on and the next.
So far, the only ones I've seen, Paul, are Whitney and Brian.
And Jerry, I saw Jerry come in.
Did he?
So, all right. So Spencer McBride is the author of the 1844 Campaign for President by Joseph Smith. And I think maybe I'm going to dispute just a little bit with the earlier comments about the theocratic democracy, because I really don't think Joseph Smith was campaigning on that. I have listed the fundamental campaign elements from his views on the powers and policy of the United States. And he was responding to the fact that the Bill of Rights did not at that time applied to the states. States' rights trumped federal rights. And so the Mormons got driven out of Missouri. The Cherokee got driven out of the Southeast. And the states that did that had the right to do it because there was no real guarantee for the individuals, for the groups beyond the state rights. And so Joseph Smith was advocating that the federal government needed to be able to step in and protect religious rights and individual rights. And so his views on the powers and policy of the United States included the idea of selling the lands in the West in order to buy the slaves and make it so that the slaves could go free and the owners would be reimbursed enough to make it so that they would not be hard pressed. And then they could either hire the slaves back at a going wage or change their industry. He was interested that Congress should be reduced by half and that the congressman should be paid just $2 a day, which really was more than double the normal worker's wage at that time. But give them $2 a day plus enough for food. But let's not overburden ourselves by a bunch of crazy people in Congress that are sitting around talking all the time but not getting anything done. He wanted to spread the Union to the West Sea and ultimately around the world. He did indicate that the manifest destiny doctrine, which was widespread at the time, was something he supported, and particularly that applied to incorporating Texas into the United States. I find that particularly interesting because the Texas factor, I think, was profoundly influenced by Dr. John Bernheisel, who was the doctor for Moses Austin. Moses Austin wanted to colonize Texas, and on his deathbed, he had John Bernheisel pass on to his son, Stephen Austin, the desire of his father that he should go to Texas and establish a colony. So Stephen Austin did that. And John Bernheisel, you see, was instrumental in motivating him. John Bernheisel then lived in the Mansion House from 1843 to 1847, became effectively a member of the Joseph Smith family, and clearly was there helping to write this document and influencing that Texas should be incorporated in the United States. He wanted the federal bank to provide for reliable currency. There was at this time a great deal of counterfeiting going on. As a matter of fact, the day that Joseph Smith was killed, Governor Ford gave a speech from the corner of Main and Water Street, the stand that we now have restored on that site, that Robert Cook has arranged to have available there. And when Governor Ford was standing there speaking, he had come to Nauvoo looking for bogus, because people in Illinois indicated they were getting counterfeit money from the people of Nauvoo. But the irony there is that about 10 feet from where the governor stood to give that speech, we found a counterfeit coin, a 1842 Publica Mexicana piece of 8. And so the indication with 13 elements of that coin as counterfeit suggests that it really was happening. And there's very good evidence beyond that. Theodore Turley, the neighbor of Joseph to the east on Block 147, was arrested for bogus. And then he wanted to eliminate prison for debt. He had been in prison. He knew what prison was like. And the idea of putting people in prison because they were in debt made no sense to him. How do you pay for your debt if you're sitting in prison? It means you got to get somebody else to do it, and that's not fair to them. He wanted to pardon the inmates and provide them with an education, because he figured that educating people was much better than trying to punish them. And it's interesting to note that we have historical record of something over 400 campaigners leaving Nauvoo preaching and campaigning, preaching the gospel, trying to baptize people, get them converted, and campaigning for Joseph Smith as president. So there was a pretty serious effort underway to get Joseph Smith elected. And in my book on the Mansion House, I'm going to give that special emphasis because I find it extremely interesting, curious, and historically instructive that the mansion house of Joseth and Emma Smith is the earliest example we have of a campaign site, campaign center for a presidential candidate who was assassinated. All right, I've given my quick sketch on the first two, and I would be happy to yield just a little bit there, but spend most of our time with the people that are actually here. The next would be Larry Stowe, and have we not seen him, Deb?
Oh, he's not here. Larry is not here.
Okay, he presented on Logos and the Lamp, and he spent 5 years in prison, and he spent a good deal of time teaching messages from the Book of Mormon in terms of the word, and teaching his companions in prison that if you give your word, then you need to make that a covenant, and then doing the same thing in a covenant with God, and then live by it was that was the way toward a happier life. And he was dealing with an awful lot of people who had several baby mamas, and that was because they had no real commitment. And he pointed out then to them that if you commit to helping to raise those people and give them a better education, give them a chance at seeing what love is like, that you improve their chances of happiness. I found it very interesting that Larry and Rainbow Eagle seem to connect. Rainbow Eagle advocating for the Vision Quest to help young people get a concept of who they were in their community, and Larry using the concept of Logos and the Lamp to get there. And he was encouraging people to come to Christ and covenant with Christ to change your life. Let your new beginning be guided by the light, the shepherd's light, which says, "Thy word is a lamp unto my path." And he wanted justice to be the lamp to light the path to good life. He has started a program in Chicago trying to help people in the poorest of an urban community to be able to get a grasp of this concept that if you covenant with God and covenant with other people you love, then you end up with a happier life than if you are just simply going through being pushed by the wills of others. I would yield to anybody else's comments on any of the first three. And if not, then let's go to Jerry.
Just real quick, Paul, I just wanted to say, I was just looking up on Wikipedia, and it says Smith first coined the term theodemocracy while running for president of the United States in 1844. It is also clear this concept lay behind the organization of the Council of 50 that same year. So apparently he did have some reference to it while campaigning. I just looked it up.
Okay, well, the fact that in the Council of 50, they actually wrote the Constitution for the Kingdom of God. And that was while he was running for president of the United States, which would put him as president of the Constitution. And so he had the two going at the same time. So clearly it makes sense that he would have coined the phrase. However, I question how much that was actually being utilized, because I think it would not have been a wise phrase to try to campaign on. I think that Americans at that time would have wanted to see the emphasis on the separation of church and state, not an integration of the church and state. At the same time, I recognize that here his missionaries may very well have had a different approach on that. So I'm willing to be recognized out of step sometimes. So thank you, Steve, for pulling up a reference there. All right, Jerry Grover is here to represent himself. He came to talk with us about the illumination of the birth of Christ, showing the 2 days of brightness, a day and a night, and a day with no dark. And he used the magnetosphere, the aurora borealis. Let me not get into what he did, since he's here, he can speak for himself. But I found his coronal mass ejection in the 1859 Carrington event to be very interesting. And his tracing of an end of a solar cycle to 6 to 5 BCE was intriguing as well. particularly when that got us awfully close to Herod's death at 4 BC. So, Jerry, please give us your review, if you would, please.
Can I share my screen? I've got kind of some follow-up.
No, if I'd stop share, you could.
Okay.
Now try it.
Let's see.
And please recognize that we'd like to have you back on more of your books, because you've got a wealth of material that we'd like to have you share.
Oh yeah. Okay. I couldn't get to everything there. I talked about the coronal mass emission, explained the night of illumination. Basically, when you have that happen and it hits the magnetosphere, as it did in 1869, it shifts the northern lights to southern latitudes, and also generates illumination just like daylight. So that seems to explain that. There were a couple, there's the rest of what I wasn't able to get to, which is maybe even more fascinating, I think, is the solar eclipse and the time of Christ's birth. Now, the clue to this is in the Book of Mormon. There is a verse just before, the day before, where it talks about, it's 3 Nephi 1 and 6. And it basically, 6 through 7. And it basically indicates that the wicked created a great uproar throughout the land, which isn't explained anywhere or discussed, and that is not found anywhere else in the rest of the Book of Mormon. The important thing is that, and in the Book of Mormon, they fixed a particular day for the ritual sacrifice of the righteous, of the Nephites, and they obviously had them imprisoned in some form or fashion. Otherwise, they're not going to. Who's going to volunteer for that? So, the interesting thing in Mesoamerica, among the Aztecs, the time of a solar eclipse meant something horrible was going to happen. And what they did is they could predict dates when solar eclipses would occur. Not necessarily that they would be visible in Mesoamerica, but there are certain cycles. And so they were able to predict that date. And then on that date, and prior to the day, they would ritually sacrifice people with fair complexions. And they would also make huge loud noises throughout. All of them did. They would pound drums and howl. And the reason is because they believed a serpent eats the sun. And so by doing so, it would prevent the serpent from eating the sun. That's what and there are a bunch of depictions in the Dresden Codex of the snakes eating the sun, or also jaguar, it's talked about too. Maya had a similar tradition. And I mentioned in the Book of Mormon, those exact things happened on the date of Christ's birth. So at least there was a potential for a solar eclipse, meaning that was the date where a solar eclipse was anticipated in Mesoamerica. So then the interesting thing is, okay, were there any solar eclipses that would match that time frame? And fantastically, there was. April 16th, 6 BC, there was the sun arose in near full eclipse in Mesoamerica. It also set in partial eclipse in Mesopotamia, in Persia, and Babylon, where the Magi were located. In Mesopotamia, a solar eclipse basically indicated the demise of an old king with a new replacement coming. So then the question is, okay, how does this date, which is indicative of the birth of Christ, correlate with what we know of Christ's birth? Well, first, we know from the Book of Mormon that after the crucifixion, Christ lay in the tomb for 3 full days and nights. Now, the New Testament says that as well, but a lot of biblical scholars are trying to work around that because they thought of, well, it had to be a Friday crucifixion, but it does require a Wednesday crucifixion. We know that from the Book of Mormon and also from the New Testament. And there are some New Testament scholars that do actually indicate that they believe in a Wednesday crucifixion. Christ was also crucified on a Passover. The only Wednesday where a Passover occurred in the time frame that Christ could have potentially died was March 31st, 28 AD. So that is indicative of the date of crucifixion. And interestingly enough, from the solar eclipse date to that date is basically 33 years using an uncorrected solar calendar. So that matches perfectly the Book of Mormon's time frame of Christ's life, because we do know that the length of his life from the Book of Mormon. So then the question is, does the April 16th, 6 BC birth correspond with any old world proposals, meaning non-LDS, just people that have worked on this? Interestingly enough, Michael Molnar, an astronomer, in his book, The Star of Bethlehem, uses astrological techniques of the time that would have been used by the Magi in Babylon to determine the astronomical signs when a divine king would have been perceived to have occurred. He found basically a once in a millennium occurrence of alignment of planets, certain planets that are indicative of kingship in the proper constellation Aries, which is correlated to Judea. Also, it was combined with an occultation of Jupiter by the moon, that the moon passed in front of Jupiter. All the planets were in a visual straight alignment on that day. Now, he didn't even note, he didn't know that there was a solar eclipse. He didn't mention it. He probably didn't look. But the interesting thing is that it was on the morning of the solar eclipse as well. Now, this is kind of the figure from his book where he actually kind of determines the date that would work. This is this is an astronomy software where you can actually project back in time at a particular location and see exactly what the sky looked like. So this is on that date. With the alignment of the planets. It's interesting because there's also in the Bible, there's a prophecy of the scepter at Christ's birth, which a lot of people have tried to figure out. And actually, that's kind of exactly what you're looking at here. So, so that explains the birth. And the question is, what about the Star of Bethlehem? That's the other thing that's mentioned in the Book of Mormon. Well, as a new star is mentioned in the Book of Mormon. Molnar indicates that Jupiter is a star that arose, and his actually makes a lot of sense because Herod, none of them actually saw the star. It was really only the wise men, the Magi, that knew about it. In fact, they said, "When did it arise?" And then they said, "Well, you go follow the star." They don't even know how to follow the star to find Christ. So actually, it does explain very well that the Star of Bethlehem was probably Jupiter rising. Unlike that star in the Book of Mormon, the new star had certain things associated with it. Number one, it was temporary. We know that because it 4 or 5 years later, everybody, they denied the signs and wonders and forgot about it. Unlike in Israel, it was seen by all the people. So it cannot be, we're not talking about Jupiter or some small planet. Oops, excuse me. Even though the alignment of the planets was also seen in Mesoamerica, the other thing is the astrology that was utilized by the Magi was not known. So there was no way, it's not likely that the Nephites would have known anything about this type of projection of a divine king. In addition, it does say the new star was such as one as never have been beheld. And it's important that the Book of Mormon does not indicate anywhere that the Star of Bethlehem was the new star. There's nothing that says that. People just assume that, but that's not what it says. Is there anything in Mesoamerica that would meet the new star criteria? Yes. Essentially, a southern hemispheric comet located such that it's visible in Mesoamerica, but not in Israel or China. Also China, because China recorded astronomical observations during this time period. Babylon had observations, but during this time period, we don't have any data. And it wouldn't, if it's positioned in the southern hemisphere, it would not, there's on the southern, if it's very south, it would not have been visible in Israel, but would have been visible in Mesoamerica, even though Mesoamerica is still in the northern hemisphere. There are many kinds of comets. So it actually says this one is you had never witnessed before. It could have been the location of the comet is something they've never seen, or there are just a whole variety of comets. And also, as far as a sign and wonder, the appearance of a comet in Mesoamerica is extremely frightening for those of the pagan native religion. It's not so for the Hebrews. And so that, again, that would have been another sign or wonder that they would have seen and caused them extreme amount of duress. So anyway, and then the Hebrews actually, like the Halley's comet, that actually shown during 164 BC, which is the origination of the Festival of Lights or Hanukkah. So that's what most presume that's one basis for that festival was the Halley's comet. So anyway, this is something I had not had time to get to in the prior presentation, but I thought it would be of interest to everybody. And anyway, that's kind of explains all of the astronomical events at the time of Christ's birth.
Wow. And we do want
Is
to.
that okay, Paul? Is that something you liked?
I like that stuff. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, it just amazes me how these people with specialties are able to dig up important material that yeah, even looking at the correlation between the words and what's actually happened in the world around us, getting those correlations is fascinating, and the idea that that the northern lights, comets, and so forth may have come together, sunspots, you know, all these considerations are intriguing to me. And while we may not have a compelling definitive answer, we're getting close, and I really appreciate the research that you've exposed to us.
I think like the solar eclipse and all, it actually is perfectly matches to the day the Book of Mormon dates, as well as the biblical dates. So that's kind of the fascinating thing. The coronal mass emission, again, that was something that would explain, but I can't really document that actually happened. We just know it could have. But yeah, the solar eclipse is something we know. So
I'll highlight that again, if you would, please, because I think that really is one of those artifacts that needs to be picked up, examined, and seen by everyone.
yeah, it was basically the night of illumination and the signs, some of the signs and wonders, which I explained in the prior presentation as a coronal mass emission. Basically, when the sun throws out a huge amount of solar material, when it's shifting its magnetic poles, that event in 1869 actually matched the Book of Mormon event in terms of description, location, length of time, duration, latitude, longitude. So it actually does match, but I could not actually identify that in April of 6 BC one occurred. It was consistent with the solar cycle. I did establish that. So, but on the solar eclipse, meaning you have the indication in the Book of Mormon that in fact it was a solar eclipse date, just because we know the Mesoamerican practice of what they did. It was a ritual sacrifice. They also, they sacrificed fair complected people, which is interesting. That's what the Aztecs did. And then since we know that exact date, we can then know if it matches the exact date in the old world or the crucifixion, because we know the time period of Christ's life from the Book of Mormon. We also know that it had to be a Wednesday crucifixion, so we know the year. Anyway, so now we can say with a lot more clarity, here is an exact birth date for Christ. It matches Molnar's projection of what the Magi astrologically would have determined to be the birth date of Christ. And we also can definitively answer when the day Christ died or was crucified. So it's not important doctrinally, meaning a saving, it's not something that's going to be saved by, but it certainly establishes the veracity of the Book of Mormon, also the Bible and the New Testament, all in one kind of fell swoop, I guess.
One huge fell swoop. Remarkable. Isn't this intriguing? What a fascinating bit of research. Well, let's move on, and we'll allow people to come back and bring the questions at the end. We do not have Adrian Larsen with us this evening. Adrian is the one who presented for us on the stick of Joseph, and his presentation is of a group of volunteers. Really, volunteers put this whole thing together, but they recognized that the Book of Mormon is a message to the Jews and the Gentiles, and the need to have the Book of Mormon then go to the Jews and be understood and appreciated means that needs to be translated into the verbiage that they would appreciate. And since the translations that have been made in Hebrew have been wanting, then Adrian and his group have been working on a more honest translation, getting the actual Hebrew speakers to do the translation. And they've had 4 scholars in particular working on this matter, and they've gotten a very accurate Mormon pilot, that is to say, a Hebrew translation of the Book of Mormon, so that it follows the Hebrew traditions, it uses the Hebrew terms, it identifies Yahweh, and it incorporates the feast days and so forth, and uses the kind of terms that the Hebrews can appreciate and recognize that it is their story. Ed Fonts has been pushing on the idea that the Book of Mormon is a Hebrew account, but here we have Adrian Larsen and his group translating the Book of Mormon into Hebrew to fulfill the need of a usable expression of its message into the style and verbiage reflective of the Hebrew thought and history. He did point out that the Book of Mormon musical is the most common grasp of the book that people around the world have today. But interesting that if that's your grasp of the Book of Mormon message, it's quite a ways off of the message that probably most of us on this forum would want to have presented.
Hey, Paul,
Yes,
excuse me, did you want to be sharing your screen right now?
not necessary.
Okay,
Thank you.
yep.
Adrian pointed out that Joseph Smith received the plates on Rosh Hashanah in 1827. He hid them in a tree for 10 days, and on Yom Kippur, the day of covering, the book was published. And then the Hebrew days of celebration are marked remarkably, phenomenally, by the days of the organization of the church, publication of the book, and so to be able to publish the Stick of Joseph as the Hebrew translation of the Book of Mormon is the effort that Adrian was addressing us to. And wow, what a remarkable effort it's been. And so now we have the Book of Mormon in a language that Hebrew speakers can appreciate. All right, we are to Brian Stubbs, and he had the privilege of a couple of sessions because I had read his book in advance and was so intrigued by his linguistic genius, and the simple fact that here he had spent a bunch of time studying the Semitic languages, and then went into the study of Navajo and the Uto-Aztecan language family, and so here he was finding cognates, fascicular cognates is the word I like to use, mentefacts that are resident within those languages that trace back for a couple thousand years. And to me, that is, as an archaeologist, it's fascinating when you can trace back artifacts that are telling the truth. And when you have mentefacts, and that's what these cognates are, the idea that there are root words, meaning sounds that are carried through with the common meanings. And the Book of Mormon story is a very likely explanation for why we have these common roots, especially when you're looking at the commonalities between the Hebrew and the Uto-Aztecan, and the Phoenician and the Uto-Aztecan, the Egyptian and the Uto-Aztecan, why this is just a phenomenal set of presentations. And so here, let me shut up and give Brian a chance to share with you, because his summary, well, his presentations continue to intrigue me, and I hope that his summary will capture those of you that haven't had a chance to give them the time and that they deserve. This is one of the most remarkable expressions of unique effort and genius that we've had in our year of presentations. Brian?
Thank you. I'll put on my screen so I can, let's see, I believe this is it. Okay, everybody can.
We see it.
Y'all can see it. Hey, good.
We see
I don't
it.
know. I don't know if you noticed, but I moved things to the left since that first presentation. I realized that the pictures on the right kind of cover what's on the right, so that's why I moved everything to the left. Hey, well, let's just do a quick overview. I think most of you heard some of the presentations, but yeah, we're looking at 3 language infusions into something that was already here in Mesoamerica, and it became Uto-Aztecan. The 3 infusions, let's pull up well, let's start with this. Let's start with this Native American languages. You know, we have between 1,500 to 2,000 of them. And one language family is a group of languages that are descended from the same ancient language. When people move away, their language, all languages are always changing. And we see that in English, even in your lifetime, you can see a few words take new meanings and a few new words added and so forth. And so all languages are always changing. And as people come from a common ancestry and they move apart and live in different places, their languages change in different ways, and they become first separate dialects and then separate languages, but related languages. And linguists can see that those languages are related by the common words that they share, and as long as the time depth isn't too far back. Anyway, in North America, for example, we have all of these language families. Each of those is a different language family. Of the 160 language families, I think more than half of those are in South America, and probably, I don't know, 20 or 30 in Middle America, and then probably, well, they've got them numbered right here, I believe. Well, maybe not. Anyway, probably 40 or more language families in North America. And what I did is I came home from a mission, 2 years speaking to teaching the Navajo people and trying to learn Navajo. And when I came back, I looked at a lot of language families. First, I looked at Navajo, and I realized that Navajo, as it's right here, well, this area, basically Navajo is the same area as the, well, you know where the Navajo, they're the Four Corners area, mostly New Mexico and Arizona. But they are closely related to all these languages up here in Northwest Canada and Alaska. And realized that whole language family came across the Bering Strait, so that didn't fit Lehigh very well. However, the Navajo people themselves genetically are more closely related genetically to their neighbors than they are to these other groups that speak related languages. So they're a mixture, just like everybody is a mixture of lots of things. And so they're of Lehigh too. And most Native Americans might have anywhere from 1 to 40% Lehigh, and they have anywhere from maybe 5 to 90% Bering Strait. And so they're mixtures of a lot. But what I was looking at, and I looked at about, I don't know, 40 different language families. I spent a few years just looking at a lot of them. and found a handful, not a large percentage, but maybe 5% is all that looked like they might have retained some of Lehi's language data. And the one that had the most and the clearest was Uto-Aztecan. And as I've spent the last 40 years looking at Uto-Aztecan and various others, I'm again convinced and reassured that probably Uto-Aztecan is the best case for, has the most language evidence in it, kept the most, or has the largest infusion into whatever else it mixed with. Uto-Aztecan language family is this in the Southwest United States, about 15 languages that came out of Southern California, Los Angeles area, spread into the Great Basin. And then the other half of the language family is along the west coast of Mexico. And that's 29 of the 30 Uto-Aztecan languages. The other, well, I'm going to go down to my, are the Nahuatl or the Aztec dialects. There are about 30 of them. This map shows the biggest ones, the main ones, several different Aztec dialects. And so I spent my life, the last 40 years, studying Uto-Aztecan. First became a specialist in the language family, publishing this Uto-Aztecan, a comparative vocabulary that was well received among linguists and Uto-Aztecanists. Also this White Mesa Ute dictionary and so forth. And then also this book that Jerry Grover helped me or sponsored, and we put it together with the Exploring the Explanatory Power of Semitic and Egyptian in Uto-Aztecan. And the presentation was basically a number of the words, sound changes. I think we had a short linguistics course there somewhere, but the meaning of it all, or what I found, it's interesting. I started looking, I assumed, I just kind of, for some reason in my brain, I just kind of thought, all the Nephites are gone. And so I was just looking for a Lamanite language that had some Hebrew in it. That's what I was looking for. But lo and behold, as I looked, I did find Uto-Aztecan had a sizable chunk of Hebrew, and but I also found that it had a whole bunch of Egyptian, which surprised me a little bit, but not a lot. We know that the Nephites are dealing also with Egyptian, and although some scholars, the Hebraists at BYU, they all think that they were not dealing with the Egyptian language, only an Egyptian script, that they're only, Hebrew was the only old world language they brought with them. However, I found lots of Egyptian, and that kind of solved that controversy in my mind, and I think it has in many of their minds as well, that Hugh Nibley was right. He was the one that said, no, they were dealing with the actual Egyptian language and Hebrew also. And then, to my huge surprise, I find that the Egyptian had a different set of sound correspondences than the Hebrew that I was finding. And then I find a whole bunch of Aramaic. And the Aramaic, let me find let me just find something here that you can look at while I do all this talking. Well, maybe it's better that I don't even distract you. Yeah, we'll just look at this and I'll talk. So you don't try to read what I'm not saying. And then I find a whole bunch of Aramaic, which is interesting because later, as in my studies of Semitic, I found that a number of Semitic scholars in Semitic languages, were saying that the northern Israelites, the northern tribes, probably never lost their Aramaic. Or if they did, they would have regained it easily because they were right next to, let me find that, yeah, here it is. They were right next to this large Aramaic speaking area right here. Manasseh especially is in the northeast of all the tribes of Israel, and that right next to the Aramaic lands. And remember that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Leah and Rachel, Laban's daughters, and Laban was, what was he, Rebecca's brother, Isaac's wife, and they all came from Aramaic speaking areas. In fact, in the Old Testament, Laban is called the Aramaean. And so they were native speakers of Aramaic, came over here, and after they settled in Palestine, probably, I don't know whether it was before they went to Egypt or after they came out, probably a little of both maybe. Anyway, they eventually learned the language of the area, which was Canaanite or Phoenician, and Hebrew is the Israelite dialect of Canaanite. And so, but nevertheless, many scholars figure that the northern tribes kept their Aramaic and simply probably became bilingual. They could continue speaking their Aramaic and also learn the Canaanite or the Hebrew of the Israelites. And of course, there are different dialect areas that is shown by the one story in the Old Testament where they tested them on pronouncing a certain word. Anyway, so I find this Aramaic, and it has the same sound correspondences as the Egyptian, but different than the Hebrew that I was finding. And then I realized as I looked closer that the Hebrew was more like Phoenician. Okay, the Hebrew was what happened in the history of Hebrew is that Hebrew had a couple of pairs of sounds that stayed separate. They were originally separate in Proto-Semitic, and they stayed separate in biblical Hebrew, in the Hebrew that the Israelites were speaking. And they have evidence of this because of some of the writings, for example, in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament that was translated into Greek when many Jews were living in Greek-speaking areas, show that these sounds that were different originally remained different clear up until about 300 BC. And Uto-Aztecan in the P dialect, Semitic P I call it, shows those differences, that the two remain separate. So it matches the sounds of the Israelites before 300 BC. Now these sound changes happened in Phoenician, or perhaps all of Canaanite, 1,000 years earlier. The reason we know this is because the Phoenician alphabet, those two pairs are merged from 4 sounds into just 2 sounds. The chait and the chait become the same, and the ain and the gain become the same. And those happened in Phoenician before they created their alphabet, because those are already combined, and the alphabet came about somewhere around 1200, 1400 BC or so. So that those two became the same sound 1,000 years earlier than they did in the Israelite speech. And what we find is in Semitic Kwa, in the one Hebrew, Phoenician-like Hebrew dialect, we have the Phoenician sound changes. However, in Semitic P and in the Egyptian, we have the old Israeli sound changes. And all of that comes together and interestingly points to actually it's an Aramaic / Hebrew / Egyptian component, where it has the one set of sound changes. It fits nicely, not just not Lamanite and not Lehite generally, but Nephite, and who had merged with the Mulekites. And so it appears that the Mulekites were this Phoenician, carried on this Hebrew / Phoenician like Hebrew dialect, and that the Nephites were the speakers of the Semitic Aramaic dialect. And so it looks like Uto-Aztecan is actually descended from the Nephite Mulekite merger, not really a Lamanite language after all. And a couple of interesting pieces of alignment for that are that, remember in the Book of Mormon, it talks about the about 100 maybe 50 BC, I can't remember, sometime within a century before Christ, the people in Hagoth's day, the people launched into the West Sea and sailed to the land northward. And you have 29 of the 30 Uto-Aztecan languages, either on the west coast of Mexico or on the west coast of California. It's where they originally landed and then spread inland from there. So that fits that group of people. And the Aztec dialects are scattered all over. Who knows? They might be leftovers of what the Nephite language was, whether they were Nephite survivors or the Gadiant robbers who were breakoffs from the Nephites living in the mountains and helping with on the wrong side of the destruction or whatever. Anyway, a lot of pockets of Aztec in these areas in Central America. Also, another interesting bit of information that came out of this research is that it appears that the Mulekites came on a Phoenician vessel for two reasons. One, their dialect was more Phoenician-like than it was Israeli Hebrew-like. And two, they named their river Sidon or Sidon, and that is Phoenician geography, not Israeli geography. In fact, Sidon is the major port city where Phoenician ships shipped out of, and they were the seafaring people of the millennia before Christ. I mean, they were the ones who sailed all over the Mediterranean and out into the Atlantic, up northward up to the coast of Europe and southward along the coast of Africa. And no doubt that they could also cross the ocean. In fact, if you look at on a globe, the length of the Mediterranean is actually a little bit longer than it is from the distance across the Atlantic and the closest points. And so the fact that they named the river Sidon and that they have the Phoenician sound changes in their language suggests, in my mind anyway, the probability, nothing's 100% for sure yet, but a decent probability that they might have come over on a Phoenician vessel. And then we go into some other language families that have lesser amounts of this infusion. And again, it's the same infusion, a Lehite infusion. I mean, it's some of the same words, some of the same sound changes. We talked about the Muskogean language family here in the southeast United States, and the Algonquian language family up here in the northeast United States and eastern Canada. And then also Quechua down in South America in about 5 or 6 different countries along the Andes mountain range is the largest, actually is the largest language family in the Americas with about 6 million speakers still of different Quechua dialects, we could call them. However, they cannot even understand each other sometimes, so they're different Quechua languages. The second largest, it's kind of a tie between Mayan and Aztec. Aztec in that we're just showing you. All these Aztec dialects, the number of speakers, adding all of these up, is about 1.5 million. In fact, what's interesting is the ones in the north are the larger dialects. I mean, some of these have like 300,000 and 400,000 speakers, whereas these in the south are very small. In fact, Pipil in El Salvador has like less than 100 speakers left. I think these have between 100 and 300 maybe. So all of these are very small, whereas these that are further north are or some of them anyway, are quite large. Again, suggesting that maybe the destruction happened somewhere in there. And then maybe these guys were out and about and far enough away. Remember, it says that after the Nephites were killed, that there was war throughout all the land. They were fighting each other. So after they killed the Nephites, hey, everybody was in a bad mood, and they started taking it out on each other after they'd finished off the Nephites. And so maybe they're fighting each other, busy enough fighting each other that just kind of forgot about these other groups, or maybe they were like those other possibilities we mentioned. I don't know, and we don't know, but anyway, so we have in Let's see, where did it go? There it is. So anyway, we talked about those 4 language families. Mainly Uto-Aztecan has the clearest case with the most preserved data, words, vocabulary, and some interesting grammar things that we didn't really get time to go into. Muskogean and Quechua probably have second, with maybe half as much, maybe a little bit less than half as much as those. Algonquian has less than either of those. Is really mixed with a lot of who knows what else, but what little they have is quite interesting. And so that's basically what we talked about.
Thank you, Brian. We're running the time factor, but I do want you to come back after Whitney speaks to address what are the next steps of research that you would like to recommend for the generation yet to come.
Okay.
But let's give Whitney the chance to give her summary first. And thank you, Whitney, for joining us.
Yes. Sorry I took too long.
All right. Well, it carries over in the next hour. It's all right.
Do you want me to go right now?
Yes, Whitney,
Okay, I'm just trying to get my,
now, Brian, need to allow Whitney the screen share, if you would, please.
okay, I don't know if mine will work, we'll see. I'm trying to get it to pop up. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, can you see that?
Both good and evil.
Yes.
Yep.
Even.
Okay, so I'm a current member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints based in Salt Lake City, Utah. And my presentation was in regard to a book I wrote called Joseph Smith Revealed that attempts to let Joseph speak for himself with all of the records and sermons and newspaper articles and other things that he did and said to exonerate himself from what he called the crime of polygamy. So an angel explained to Joseph Smith in September of 1828 that both good and evil would be spoken about him among all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people. I think I actually might have, sorry, I might have put the wrong date on that. I do typos too often. God reiterated what the angel had said when Joseph was in Liberty Jail. The ends of the earth shall inquire after your name, and fools shall have you in derision, and hell shall rage against you. So many things today are said of Joseph Smith, which are both good and evil. One of those regards Joseph's purported involvement in plural marriage. We live in an amazing age when the digitization of records and the internet have allowed truths to come forward that have long slept in dusty archives. Looking at the evidence that is used today to prove that Joseph Smith was a polygamist reveals that the only contemporary sources of such evidence mainly come from John C. Bennett, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and other members of the 12 during the Nauvoo time period, as well as William Clayton and a few others. Bennett, oh, sorry, I should have done it like this. Let me hurry and fix that. I can figure out how to do it. And then you won't have to see all the little things I changed. Okay, Bennett was involved in a host of sexually deviant practices. And when he was caught and exposed in the times and seasons, he became very bitter and angry towards Joseph and placed the blame for his own indiscretions and sins upon Joseph's shoulders. He is not a credible witness to truth. There are more and more records coming forward today that indicate that Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and other members of the 12 began teaching each other the doctrine of polygamy while on their missions in England in 1839 and 1840. Brigham Young and Lorenzo Snow both claim to have had their own revelations regarding polygamy during their missions in England. Their records, which are used to prove Joseph's involvement in polygamy, were written years later and not during Joseph's lifetime. One instance of that is Heber C. Kimball wrote in 1846 in his journal. He said, "Oh, I need to record some things that happened in Nauvoo in 1844." And so a lot of he and Brigham's things are backdated. William Clayton had 2 sets of journals covering the Nauvoo years, which are housed in LDS Church archives. One set was kept during the Nauvoo years, and that set never points the finger at Joseph Smith as the author of polygamy. The other set is a copy of his Nauvoo journal with insertions and edits which do claim Joseph's knowledge and involvement of polygamy. And those insertions and edits, the second set copy, was created when William Clayton lived in Utah. So the logical conclusion is that someone is lying about polygamy. Either Joseph Smith was involved and lied continually and often regarding it, even excommunicating men for their involvement in it, or Brigham Young and those who followed him west to Utah lied about Joseph's involvement to promote their own agendas. And we discussed last week when I presented that the main agenda that Brigham had at the time was that he needed to prove to the US government. He had a senator who advised him that if he could prove that Joseph Smith was the author of polygamy, then they could claim that it was a foundational teaching of the Restoration, and therefore Brigham could continue to practice it under the idea of freedom of religion. And so he definitely had a reason to lay it on Joseph's shoulders. And Brigham also learned very quickly that he did not have as much persuasive power as a prophet, such as Joseph did. Brigham often stated that he had never seen the Lord and he was not a prophet. And so he learned very quickly that people were more likely to obey if a prophet stated it. And so he also used Joseph's name to get people to accept his order of polygamy, doctrine of polygamy. And we also discussed last week that there's a plethora of witnesses who lived during the time who lay the teachings of polygamy at Brigham's feet and not at Joseph's. So there are an ample number of records available today, which we can study to consider both sides of the issue. One of the greatest sources of those records are the Joseph Smith papers. Those you can find free online, and you can also buy printed copies. They are published under the LDS Church. My daughter has a former mission companion who works on the Joseph Smith Papers project, and she told my daughter that about 50 to 75% of available records are released to the public, but that before anything is released, it does go through a committee overseen by the First Presidency of the LDS Church, and that there are about 25% up to 50% of the records which they will not give approval to be released. But of those records that we do have, we are able to see that Joseph and Hiram consistently and very vocally spoke out against polygamy. One of the last General Conference talks that Hiram Smith gave shortly before his murder, He called polygamy the damned foolish doctrine of polygamy and vowed to excommunicate any man found teaching, preaching, or practicing it. He also stated that those men's names would be published in the papers for the whole world to see. One of Joseph's last sermons, a month before his murder, he told the saints that they never knew him. They did not know his heart. He explained that he had been charged with the crime of polygamy since he first married Emma, but that he had only ever had one wife. So God, Scripture, and Joseph all agree on what God's law of marriage is, and that is monogamy. If you will take the time to consider Joseph's own words, coupled with God's own words regarding his law of marriage, which is monogamy, you will see that Joseph consistently and continually taught the saints to live faithful, virtuous, monogamous marriages. If Joseph Smith was lying about plural marriage, then in addition to being a liar, he was a hypocrite, a philanderer, and a pedophile. However, if he was telling the truth, then he has been the victim of a great fraud, and we would do well to do all we can to exonerate his name. Joseph said in 1840, "We are aware that false and slanderous reports have gone abroad. Thus we find that there has been frauds, secret abominations, and evil works of darkness going on, leading the minds of the weak and unwary into confusion and distraction, and all of which has been endeavored to be palmed upon the presidency, who were ignorant of these things which were practiced upon the church in our name. And now, brethren, what can we enumerate more? Is not all manner of evil of every description spoken against us falsely? We have been misrepresented and misunderstood and belied, and the purity of our hearts have not been known, and our souls have been bowed down, and we have suffered much distress in consequence thereof, and truly we have had to wade through an ocean of trouble." A choice is placed before us. Will we choose to believe Joseph's own words, or will we choose to believe others who have put the blame of their own sins upon his shoulders? While in Liberty Jail, the Lord told Joseph that the pure in heart and the wise and the noble and the virtuous shall seek counsel and authority and blessings constantly from under your hand. And your people shall never be turned against you by the testimony of traitors. And although their influence shall cast you into trouble and into bars and walls, you shall be had in honor. And but for a small moment, and your voice shall be more terrible in the midst of your enemies than the fierce lion, because of your righteousness, and your God shall stand by you forever and ever. So the only reason that this matters is because Joseph Smith was a servant of God. And as such, the main thing that he restored was a correct understanding of the character, perfections, and attributes of God. And one of those is that God believes in monogamous, faithful marriages. To lay the sin of polygamy upon Joseph's shoulders is to say that God is a liar and a hypocrite himself, because God starts off the very Bible with a monogamous marriage between Adam and Eve and commands them to remain faithful to each other. And so I just ask that if Joseph, the only reason Joseph matters is because his testimony of God matters, and the world continually rejects Joseph Smith because they believe that he was a polygamist and a man who was a hypocrite and a liar. So if we want the world to consider Joseph's words and thereby have another witness to the reality that Jesus Christ lives, then we would do well to help exonerate Joseph of those lies. And that is all I have.
Whitney, if you would please give us a quick clarification of the Book of Mormon background on marriage.
Yeah, so the Book of Mormon, we do not have the lost 116 pages that were the Book of Lehi. I believe if we had those, it would be very clear that monogamy is commanded by God, because when Jacob comes on the scene and gives his sermon, and it's the first generation of people born in the land of promise. So he comes on the scene and he's, Jacob's basically, he's saying his heart is broken because he has to correct his people, and some sin has crept in among them. And he talks about pride, and he talks about wealth and not being one. And then he says, I wish that was all I had to talk to you about, but now I've got to talk to you about a grosser crime. And then he goes into the men who have wanted to enter into polygamy. And he says very clearly that their father Lehi was commanded when he was brought out of Jerusalem to have only one wife. And so Jacob reiterates that the commandment of the Lord is that a man should only have one wife, and concubines he should have none. And we looked up the definition of concubine, which is not the definition that always gets used, especially by the church I'm a member of, the LDS Church. They always like to say concubine is a wife of lesser social status. That is a definition, but the main definition during Joseph's day and age was that a concubine was a woman who lived with a man without a legal and lawful marriage. And so that's basically what plural marriage is in many parts of the United States still today, because it is not a legal form of marriage. And so any woman you have past wife number one that's a legal wife would be considered in 1828 dictionary as a concubine, because she is not your legal wife. So Jacob very strongly condemned polygamy, plural marriage. The one thing that my church uses to skirt around that issue is that they claim that the book of Jacob says, unless commanded by God to raise up seed, and they claim that raising up seed means to have a lot of children. But that's actually a misunderstanding of the scriptures. Jacob, if you look through the whole sermon of Jacob, he earlier talks about that Lehi and his family were brought out of Jerusalem in order to raise up a righteous branch of the house of Israel to God. So to raise up seed is to give people, to make people more righteous, more holy, more like God, more like Joseph and Hiram Smith were, men who can enter back into the Lord's presence and be redeemed from the fall. That is to become good seed, or to be raised up to the Lord. And so Jacob in his sermon, he actually says, I will command my people if I want to raise up seed to me. So he's saying, I'm giving you a commandment to be monogamous because that will help raise you up to me. And then he further states that the Lamanites, who the Nephites thought of as wicked, perverse people, he said they have been more righteous than you because they have obeyed this commandment. And because they've obeyed this commandment that was given to Father Lehi, they will be preserved in the land and they will be blessed. So that is what Jacob says about polygamy. He's very much against it. And then in the Book of Mormon, further, we have King Noah, who is called a wicked man and says he did not do that which was right in the sight of the Lord, for he had many wives and concubines. And then we also have the story of Riplakish, who is a Jaredite, who also says the same thing. It says he was a wicked man who did not do right in the sight of the Lord, for he had many wives and concubines. So the Book of Mormon is very clear on what the Lord's law of marriage is. I saw in the chat, the question came up, then how do we explain section 132? And we talked about that quite a bit last week. Just to recap really quickly, Joseph Smith testified when the Nauvoo Expositor came out in June of 1844. William Law, who had been a former first presidency member to Joseph, had gotten sideways with Joseph. And one of the things he'd gotten sideways was that Joseph had begun teaching about eternal marriage. And William Law had committed adultery and admitted he had committed adultery, and then gone to Joseph and asked for Joseph to seal he and Jane's marriage. And Joseph refused based on him being an adulterer. Well, William Law got upset about that because Hiram had been sealed to his first wife, Jerusha. And so William felt like because Jerusha had died and then Hiram remarried after that to Mary Fielding, then William felt like Hiram was committing adultery because he had a wife sealed to him in heaven. And so he felt like there was some hypocrisy there. But it's because he didn't understand that he just didn't understand God's laws. So William Law twists the revelation into the Nauvoo Expositor. Joseph and Hiram both testified before the Nauvoo City Council that Joseph had received a revelation, most likely in the spring of 1843, because Joseph said at that time he had been pondering and praying on the scripture that neither is man given in marriage in the resurrection, but will remain as an angel. And it was given to Joseph to understand that in the beginning, God had done the marriage between Adam and Eve. And when God ordains it and gives authority to man, as he did to Adam, to perform marriages, that those marriages have the ability to last beyond this life, but that mankind had apostatized from that truth, and there was no longer that authority. And so, and they were no longer being married under that authority. And so Joseph immediately began teaching this concept. And the concept was that if any contracts, marriages, anything entered into only with the authority of man will end death, and they will be angels in heaven. And then he further testifies to the High Council that it had nothing to do with polygamy, that it was just a quick little, a lot of people testified it was just a small little revelation. He actually taught it on July 16th, 1843 to the people. And he said it was just very simple. It was, you need to be married in view of eternity by authority from God. So Hiram also testified that that's all it had to do with, and that William Law had twisted it and perverted it. Many people, so it disappeared. It was written down most likely in preparation for his talk on July 16th. It disappears. No one knows where it went until 1852, a few weeks after Mary Fielding, who was Hiram's second wife, who had never was sealed to Hiram while Hiram was alive. She dies. And so she's the last witness that Joseph and Hiram were monogamous. So in Utah, so she passes away, and 2 weeks later, Brigham, under his direction, has Orson Pratt get up and introduce polygamy publicly for the first time. So they were still doing it secretly, and it really exploded after Joseph's death. But a lot of the saints actually did not know they were practicing polygamy. And after that public announcement, the entire talk was spent proving it was a constitutional right. And then they read the revelation, which they claimed that is now known as D&C 132 for the LDS people. Orson Pratt explained that when Joseph had the revelation that he had received it earlier, that then on July 12th, 1843, he had William Clayton write it down. And then William Clayton ran it over to a clerk at the Whitney store named Joseph Kingsbury, he testified later in the Temple Lot case that in like 45 minutes, he copied it down perfectly, no mistakes, no crossouts. He copied down this huge revelation, word for word perfectly in 40 minutes. Then William Clayton ran it back to Joseph, where Emma then got upset and burned it. So Emma, she testifies when it comes out in 1852, interestingly enough, about 3,000 saints left the church at that time, the LDS church, and went back east, and about 2,000 to 3,000 went to California. So his announcement caused quite a few saints distress, and when they realized it was publicly being done, they left the church. So what was known as Section 132 comes out in 1852. Brigham claims he had it locked in a drawer, that he says it's a copy of a copy that we locked in our drawer, brought it out. He brings it out. Somebody asked Emma Smith what she thought of it. She said, I've never heard it or seen it before. And those saints in Utah, basically all of the vile lies told about my husband, they are bringing into reality. And then other saints in the Temple Lot case, in 1890-ish, I think, they also testified that it's not the same revelation, that they had seen the original or had it read to them, and that it's not the same. So Brigham Young actually keeps it tucked away until 1876, when under his direction, the Doctrine and Covenants is redone, and he has Section 101 from the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, which states one man, one woman is the law of the church. It is called the Law or Statement on Marriage. Joseph quoted from it often. Brigham has that removed, and he has 132 put in it. And so that is a little history of Section 132.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let me highlight that we have Rainbow Eagle, who will be presenting next week on the Native American prophecies for the past, the present, and future. And we also have Frank Fry, who will be following him on the Curse of the Lamanites. But the rest of the evening really should be devoted to your questions for the three presenters that we have. Plus, I will try to field any questions that you have on the others that were not here to defend themselves. But since you have three such articulate and remarkable researchers, the floor is open. And Ron Smith has a hand up. That strategy of looking down at the bottom and finding the place to put your hand up is a good one. And Deb, I saw, was wearing a coat and headdress to suggest that she was freezing, so we may have lost that monitor. So I'll call on hands when I can see them. Ron.
I'm still here, Paul.
Okay. Don't freeze.
No, I'm not.
Well, I wanted to ask a question of Jerry Grover. I really appreciated the things that you've said, and I'm hoping to get a chance to look at them closer and do more study. But there was one small little tiny thing. And if you have a short answer, that's fine. If you don't have a short answer, then don't worry about it. But you said that you were convinced that it was a Wednesday crucifixion because of the timelines that are given, or I think that was because of the timelines that are given. And I agree that it couldn't have been a Friday crucifixion and done. But when I count the 3 days and 3 nights, you have the 3 nights and then raised on the 3rd day. I get a Thursday event rather than a Wednesday event, and when I back it up to what would have been in America, then it would have started on Thursday morning rather than Thursday evening, and if I put it on Wednesday, it seems like it's too long. But so I'm just asking, what is the rationale for saying that it's a Wednesday rather than a Thursday crucifixion?
Well, we know from the Book of Mormon, you have two timelines, right? There's 8 hours, roughly 8 hours difference, but
Right, right.
yeah, you have in the old world, we know the times of Christ's crucifixion, the third hour. I mean, so you have the different hours, right?
Mhm.
And so, and it also, so we can making that correspond with the times in Mesoamerica. And we know that the destruction started, the darkness at 3 hours, and then the mist of darkness came. Anyway, you can basically correlate that. So Christ was put in the tomb somewhere, let's say on Wednesday in the evening, right? So, and you have the Hebrew day is sunset to sunset.
Right.
So you have a Wednesday to Thursday, Thursday to Friday, Friday to Saturday. We know if it was Thursday, well, in the old world, in the New Testament, they went to the tomb on Sunday before it became light. He was gone. So in order for a Thursday to work, you'd have to have Thursday to Friday, Thursday evening to Friday evening, Friday evening to Saturday evening, and Saturday evening to Sunday evening. It doesn't work. You have 3 full days, because we know Christ was, we know his crucifixion. Does that make sense?
Well, okay. I think I see how you're counting that. To me, it looked like. Well, I probably need to sit down with you and just.
Yeah, and you can actually. I've got a paper.
calendar.
I've got this all in a paper. I'm not the only one that's published on it, but I have a paper on academia.edu, which I can. Actually, you can just do a search, Jerry Grover, academia.edu, and it's basically an art. It's a full article on all the stuff I presented.
Okay, I'll look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a small question, but it seemed okay. So I'll leave it right there. Thank you very much.
So I get, and what I'm saying is, you have to have the full 3 days that you laid in the tomb, because that's what Samuel Lamanite indicated that the darkness correlated with. So
yes, but okay.
And I'm saying, and we know in the old world, in the old world, we know he was crucified at like 3 p.m. in the afternoon, based on what's in the New Testament.
Okay, I was thinking about the time that he was actually in the tomb, rather than the time that he was at the time he was crucified. I would have said the time he was crucified would have been on Wednesday as well, but I mean, wow.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm just saying, basically, if you look at those days, you really do have to end up with him being in the tomb, being resurrected sometime Saturday evening, basically, which is the day, which matches the day, which is still a third day, because it goes sunset to sunset. So it actually,
right. It's on the third day that he's resurrected. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think I saw Rainbow Eagle waving a hand. However, I would call to your attention that on the bottom of your screen, reactions will allow you to raise a hand there. That way you don't have to sit there and wave at me. But good wave at you anyway, Roland. Go ahead.
I like doing that. That's okay.
Okay.
I'll keep this short. Whitney, I believe that there has been some discussion, maybe I've missed some of your presentation, that in order for women to enter into the kingdom, they had to be married to a priesthood or to certainly a Mormon man. Am I making sense? Because obviously, with the crossing of the land, there would be a lot of absence of the men, and women were in quite a predicament, trying to make sure that they could achieve or get into the
upper echelons of the LDS thinking. Do you have any research for me on that? Am I making this clear?
You are making sense. Yes, that is also one of the justifications that Brigham, well, not Brigham at the time, but what the church today may be justifications for Brigham's polygamy. But if you go back and look at census records, there actually were more men than women in Utah. So they had plenty to choose from. If you go back and read, Orson Pratt was sent back to Washington, D.C. to try and convince Congress and other people back there that polygamy was a good thing to allow the saints to do. And so he started a magazine periodical he called The Seer, naming it after Joseph. So again, it gave the illusion to people that he was printing Joseph's teachings and words. And in that, they justified, they acknowledged that there were actually more men than women, but their justification was that there were very few men as righteous as the 12. And so that was their justification.
Of course, there's the dilemma of how the church looked upon women in general. How is it that they were not able to come into the priesthood, but how is it that they were able then to get access to the higher realms? I understood that they had to be somehow connected to or even married to a priesthood before they could even enter into the higher realms.
So I think that's, maybe some people do believe that. Paul the Apostle taught that, he taught about that an unbelieving spouse can be sanctified by a believing spouse, either direction, either the man who's unbelieving by a believer or a woman. Paul also taught that neither is the woman without the man nor the man without the woman in the Lord. Joseph and Hiram reiterated that. Joseph and Hiram, when they were co-presidents and co-prophets, Hiram dictated or wrote out a letter and sent it around the world in 1842, telling people to stop leaving their unbelieving spouses, and reiterated Paul's teaching that an unbelieving spouse can obtain and receive blessings from the belief of the believing spouse. And so, yes, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, and a lot of it perhaps was based out of misunderstanding of scripture. If you go all the way back to Abraham, well, first of all, one of the other things that the LDS Church claims is that, in section 132, that a man can be commanded to do polygamy. Hiram Smith stated emphatically, just before he was killed, a few months before, in one of his last General Conference talks, he stated emphatically that the Lord has never commanded any man to enter into polygamy. So then you have to go, well, okay, in scripture, we only have for sure 2 instances where 2 men who were known as prophets and patriarchal fathers were polygamists. Neither of those were commanded by God. So there is never a command by God. In fact, God commands that a man and a woman are to be faithful to each other, and that together they are to rise up until they receive promises from the Lord, who is the ultimate Holy Spirit of promise. And
okay, but then what would be the dilemma of the single mother, or the unmarried women?
I don't think I think you need to put in men in that same category. I don't think we can just say a single woman has any more rights than a single man. I think any single man or single woman who is faithful to the Lord will not withhold blessings and promises from them. I think this
Thank you.
all comes to throughout scripture, the Lord consistently clarifies he is the only gatekeeper and he is our only judge. And so we have lots of churches and thousands that have tried to figure out exactly how to do God's religion. And ultimately, he does reiterate throughout scripture, nothing is withheld from the righteous. And so that's how I would answer that.
Okay, well, Frank is raising a hand, but I got mine up there first, and mine's in the corner. So I'm going to go back to Brian and ask for him to answer my earlier question about the research that yet needs to be done on this set of linguistic problems that he's raising.
Paul, can I insert something for a second? I did post in the chat the link to that paper.
Now you got the link there?
Yeah, I put it in the chat. Yeah.
Good, thank you. All right. Brian, you want to respond to me?
Yes, okay. You asked the question, what's the future of the research? Is that right?
Yeah, what if you had given your next 10 lifetimes, what are you going to focus on?
Yes, that's what I need is a couple of more lifetimes. And I have started eating my vegetables, see if that helps. Yes, the 4 language families that I mentioned would be a good place to continue. And there's actually much more that could be done in Uto-Aztecan as well. And there are another half a dozen language families, mostly in South America, the northern areas of South America, in Colombia and the northern Andes and eastward of the Andes into the jungles. There are a number of language families in that area that have a lot of interesting stuff. And the problem is you can spend a lifetime in each language family. And if I could, I've hoped through the years that a young scholar would become interested in this and make it overlap for a few years, and he or she could continue on where I left off. But that hasn't happened yet. I did have one young scholar who read of my work when he was in high school, and he wanted to do that. And so he went to the University of Chicago, got a PhD, but he realized that he could not do both. Native American research is basically the domain of a linguistics department, and could not get a background in linguistics and launch into a Native American language family and get a background in the Semitic languages plus Egyptian. So he chose the Egyptian Semitic half. In fact, he is one of the 3 endorsers on the back of that book of Changes in Languages. That's David Calabro, a very impressive young scholar. He's probably in his 30s now, maybe approaching 40. But he's done very well in Semitic and Egyptian. He's publishing in some of the impressive journals, the foremost journals. But he did do well in the Semitic Egyptian half. But that's the problem, is it's just takes so much. I mean, one brain in one lifetime can only do so much with, say 50 languages. I mean, Uto-Aztecan is 30 languages, and you add a few Semitic languages and Egyptian and stage of Egyptian, and it comes to about 35 or 40 languages. And I do the best I can, but I haven't fully mastered any of them, but I have a decent understanding of most of them. And so that's the problem. It's just such a big effort, such a big complex problem, that it'd be nice if you could get 3 or 4 people working on different dimensions of it, working together. But even one person that is interested would be good. But so far, nobody's tackled both areas of research, and it is intimidating. and there are no university positions that, I mean, the university positions will hire either half, either a linguistics department for Native American studies or Semitic department for Near Eastern studies. But so when a person launches into that, they basically have to devote a life free of charge. I mean, you do it for fun and for no pay, which is what I've done. I taught English at College East in Utah for 30 plus years and did this on the side. And so I don't know if we're ever going to get another one to come along or not. I'm hoping so, but so far that person has not materialized.
I'm very much in sympathy with that. The one best prospect I had was Whitney Bacon, who got her PhD in archaeology at University of Pennsylvania, but specialized in the Maya, not in Nauvoo. And so here I am, having specialized in archaeology of Nauvoo, and yeah, there's lifetime to continue to dig, and nobody. Maybe this new great grandson will pick it up. I'm not going to give up yet. All right, Frank.
Get myself on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
I haven't been using my headphones tonight, so I was unsure whether that be okay or not. But comment back to Whitney here, and for the whole group, for Rainbow Eagle and his comment. Women who do not become mothers are not limited from the celestial kingdom any more than men who do not become priesthood members. I like to say that women give birth into the world, and priesthood bring rebirth. And that's why I believe in a male priesthood, because otherwise the women have a lot more blessing than the men do. Another thing, the way I understand that the scriptures have been accepted in as authoritative in the church is when they are voted upon by the people. You know, the Doctrine and Covenants that was used by the first organized church, the 1835 edition, was voted on by the people. There was a conference that voted on that, and the scriptures were accepted at the beginning of the church as the Book of Mormon and the Bible, and then later the Doctrine and Covenants was added, and they all came by the voice of the people that accepted them. There's a lot of things that happened in Utah that were never voted on by the people. And there are things that have happened elsewhere that have been voted on by the people, and it's caused problems within the church wherever that's happened. When people have voted in the wrong way, it's kind of like when the Israelites came out of Egypt. They got the law, they went straight to the promised land, and they sent the 12 witnesses in there to, some people call them spies, to spy out the land. They come back and 10 of them have a negative testimony and 2 of them have a positive. Well, the 10 convinced the whole people of Israel not to go in. The Lord accepted that, but that brought the whole group of people there under condemnation for another 40 years because they were in the land spying out, witnessing about what they saw for 40 days. And the Lord said, okay, for 40 years, then 1 day for 1 year, you're going to spend in the wilderness. And all of you who voted against this that were of legal age are going to die in the wilderness. And only your children who didn't vote on it get to go in. So the Lord really requires the people to accept his word and or not to. And he takes our opinion about it. A lot of things that happened, like I said, in Utah were never voted on. And I don't think they are today. There's kind of a perfunctory vote in the conferences in Utah. But if you don't vote in the right way, you get a visit at home. Is that not correct? I've heard that from my numerous LDS friends that I have both in the United States and in Latin America. Anyway, just my comment. And I agree with Whitney on the idea that the women who become mothers are not limited to being kept out of the celestial kingdom. And by the way, it was Brigham that invented the 3 different levels of the celestial kingdom too. That was never part of the doctrine of the church before that time. It was basically in section 132, I think, when it began.
Yeah, just really quick to add to that, Joseph Smith, received a vision where he saw his brother Alvin.
Mm-hmm.
He said he saw him in the celestial kingdom. And then Joseph himself actually said, Paul saw to the 3rd heaven and I have seen to the 7th, which correlates with Jacob in the Old Testament, who has the dream of the ladder with 7 rungs. So that's interesting. But yeah, so I feel like, Alvin wasn't married, and yet the Lord let him know that Alvin was judged on his heart. So
right,
just add that there.
Well, we did have a request in the chat that all of the presenters or whoever of the presenters would be able to provide their PowerPoint to either you or perhaps Robert, for sharing on the links, so that the PowerPoints themselves would actually be available. I think Whitney did that the last time. That if all the presenters could perhaps PowerPoints.
How do we do that exactly? Just by email or?
probably.
Yeah, if you would send them, this is Robert, and if you would send them to me, I would be happy to post them along with the presentation file. There actually are also files that I have for the audio only and for the chats. So, if there's an interest in any of those, I'd be happy to get them posted. Or do it individually on request, however it works.
Can you put your email into the chat, Robert?
Sure.
Yeah, Robert, you're saying that you did keep the chats after the different discussions.
Yes, I have all those chat files. I just have not posted them or so if anybody is interested in a particular one, just let me know.
Thank you.
David DeBarth has his hand raised then too.
Thank you. Paul has accused me of raising what I consider the dilemma of the indigenous people 12 times here. I think it's only 2, but at any rate, I'm consistently saying that when Lehi landed wherever he landed, there were indigenous people, yet the Book of Mormon says almost nothing about it. Brian did verify, I think last week, that yeah, he agreed that there had to have been indigenous people there. The Book of Mormon says nothing almost about them. And my question has been why? And why is there nothing in the Book of Mormon about indigenous people? And no one has addressed that. So I continue to struggle with it. And I have a possibility I want to toss out to this group of experts to see if anybody can shoot it down or agree with it or disagree, whichever way you want to go with it. But I would understand that maybe not the law of Moses as such, but certainly the teachers of the law taught that you needed to keep pure. You were not to marry the stranger. You were, and we see the effect of that through the Jews through 2,000 years, where Judaism still exists, in spite of all the mixing with indigenous people.
Why is that?
And so
hand
if, not if, the Book of Mormon was written by law-abiding people. The authors of each book, almost every book, the Book of Mormon, are law-abiding people. And if they're law-abiding people, then they're going to avoid that interchange with indigenous people. And that then is my suggestion of why the Book of Mormon itself, as we have it, does not mention anything about, to speak of, about the indigenous people. So I'm interested in any reactions that any of the rest of you have to that.
He had his hand up.
Paul,
Frank, go ahead.
thank you. There's two things I'd like to point out here. And one of them is that it's assumed by most people, I believe, in both fractions of the church, and I say both, there's a number of different fractions, that the Jaredite nation was entirely eradicated to the person. And I do not accept that. First of all, the Book of Ether is 30 or 40 pages long. It's like less than 10%, 5% of the entire book. And it covered twice as many years as the Nephite record did. And to think that nothing like what happened with Hagoth and others, who tens of thousands of people marched out of the Book of Mormon lands and disappeared completely from the record. And Nephi and Lehi, near the time of Christ, they went up there as missionaries into the land northward, and only one of them come back. And they had very little luck because the people become so wicked. The other idea is that if there were any Jaredites left over, they would have possibly intermixed with the Mulekite nation, because they were in the proper area at the time, because the Nephites were way off in the land south of the land southward, until about 400 years after they got there. Another possibility is that we don't have any idea what went on during the time that the lost 116 pages of the Book of Mormon. But I mean, we have part of the record, which is written by the hand of each person, Nephi, Jacob, and his their descendants. But the actual record that was taken from the large plates, that was condensed from that by Mormon, was lost. And it could be that those people that might have been there, and I believe it was probably former Jaredites, would have mixed in with them. That part of the record is missing right now, and we won't know until we get that back, or until we get the large plates, basically.
Sorry, Frank, that totally misses my question. The archaeologists, anthropologists say that the land were settled some 13,000 years ago.
Well, that's if you...
those are the indigenous people I'm talking about, and those indigenous people are ignored basically in the Book of Mormon. And I want to know, why does the Book of Mormon ignore those people who obviously were on the land long before Lehi got there?
Yeah, if you accept your dating method, then that's maybe an important idea. However, the Book of Mormon does not talk about anything that's pre-Adamic. In fact, it talks about Adam and Eve as real people over 100 times, and as the actual creation of Adam and Eve is spoken of over 100 times in the Book of Mormon. It does not allow for any tens of thousands of years before that time. So, you know, you can accept the idea of what scientists are saying as contrasted to what the scriptures say, or you can accept the other, but you can't have both. I choose to go with what the scriptures say.
I understand your interpretation of the scriptures, and I
It
accept
is
that
mine.
as your
Thank you.
interpretation. Thank you.
Right.
We've got 3 people in the queue. We got Jerry first, then Monty, then Marlene. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Jerry.
I'm just answering the question, at least from different perspectives. Number one, the Book of Mormon, really not a history. It's a lineage. It tracks the lineages. In fact, you see that in Ether, where it doesn't even care. I mean, kings are put into captivity. It doesn't even care about the other line that's reigning. It just tracks those in captivity. So it is very much a lineage. So then that way it's limiting what it's even talking about. Second is there's actually a lot of different terminologies utilized in the Book of Mormon. And I would assert, I did a translation of the characters document. There are multiple glyphs of Nephite. And so some are just members of the church, some it's people of Nephi. And honestly, for most of the history of the Nephites, they weren't very good. So really they were practicing pagan things and other things, the wicked. So it actually is kind of inclusive of a lot of different groups. And, you know, the question of when they arrived, I mean, they do mention there were, you know, goat and wild goats. Well, somebody domesticated them. So, I mean, there is some clue, you know, links, but basically the record itself doesn't talk about or concern itself with people outside of their groups. And they actually were inclusive of other groups in the polity, in the political, just as the Lamanites, it mentions they just grouped everybody that wasn't them at some point as being Lamanite. So, I mean, it kind of helps explain that question that you're posing. It may not be the best answer, but it does give you some indication of why.
An answer.
Thank you.
Monty?
Well, you guys have pretty well answered my question. It had to do with the Jaredites. I always believed that just because Corey Antimer said that they were, you know, he was the last one, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was. He might have just, that might have been his perception, but there might have been some that he didn't know about out there. And I've always believed in the Jaredites. I mean, anybody who's seen college or professional basketball believes in Jaredites.
Giants, you mean?
Anyway, that's my 2 bits.
Thanks, Monty. Marlene?
Well, I think if you believe in the scriptures, you got to believe in the Jaredites. That or something or other. I don't know. I kind of have to go along with Frank here. I'm just such a firm believer, and I guess that's because that's what's always been taught to me all my life, and from what I've read and whatever, that God had promised these people he'd bring them to a promised land. And I just feel like that. I think they're the first people here. I think he had prepared the way. He had fixed it. We talked about the things they'd have to eat. The animals were here for them and all this. I think God had prepared this all for them to come to this bountiful land and, you know, to do his will. But unfortunately, they were like we are today. They were weak, and they became more interested in their own self and their own power and whatever, and their civilizations crashed. And I'm afraid that's where, if we don't get on track and get on the ball and open our eyes to what's going on in the world today, and maybe get on our knees and pray a little more, that we're headed in that very same direction. And it kind of breaks my heart to think that that's what's happening to us today. But I think the Jaredites, I think they were the first people to land in the Americas, and God had provided that for them. And the rest is history. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Marlene. Jerry, your hand is up, and then Roger.
Yeah, just on the Jaredites, there actually is, it is mentioned that that's where the Jaredite records came from was from a remnant of the Jaredites. If you read Mosiah 8:12, you have to read it carefully, but it makes it clear that that's where those records, and again, this assumption that there were just swords all over the battlefields and everything. It's like, no, they actually got them from a particular group that survived the Jaredites. There were some remnant of them, which, if you are believing in the Mesoamerican construct, matches very well the Epa-Olmec. And they had to get the secret society stuff from somewhere later on. And so that's the conduit by which they got it. Especially when they moved into the land northward, that's when you see all of that stuff happening. Previously, it was Order of Nehor stuff when they're in the south, which is more akin to the Maya religion stuff. So anyway, it is in the Book of Mormon if you read it closely.
Thanks, Jerry. Roger?
Yeah, I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank you guys a lot, Brian and Whitney and Jerry and the others, for such of the depth and the breadth of the research that you guys have done is phenomenal, and be very difficult to dispute most of what you've got just because you've become the expert and don't seem to have a lot of peers. So I applaud you. I thank you for the blessing of it. And I thank you, Paul, just for, having this forum to continue to allow this kind of information to be shared.
Thank you, Roger.
I've got a comment.
It's Terry.
Terry, go ahead.
I want to amen to what was just said about the presenters. I think it's fabulous what they've done. But my real comment goes along with what some other people have said, that my way of understanding things is by the time the pre-Adamites, as they're called, had developed, Adam came along at the time archaeologists and anthropologists defined civilization. So God put his spirit into a person on this earth, and that person became Adam and called him man. The others, according to God, were not men. There wasn't man anyway. And that's where the priesthood came through, etc. And, you can go from there in the Bible. That accounts for people coming to the Americas in 20,000 years ago, etc. And I agree with what was said, that I think it was David said that the reason that the Book of Mormon doesn't talk about these other people is because the Nephites were brought to this land to be righteous, etc. And they were taught not to deal with the other people. It's the same thing in the Old Testament. They were chastised if somebody married outside the church, outside of the lineages, etc. And so I think the same thing applies to the Americas. So that's my opinion.
Thank you, Terry. Rainbow Eagle?
No.
There you are.
Just a short comment. That which has been shared with me and my visits and everything is the importance of being able to hold the traditions within tribalism, which means that there was a real conscious effort to stay within that particular tribe. Certainly there was opportunities for some adoption that came into most traditions. But I would say here that it seems to me like it was so important to be able to keep the traditions going by remaining, being able to marry within the tribe. They were actually married between clans, not at all between the same line, bloodline. So I'm not sure whether I'm kind of glad that somebody said, where's the indigenous people? Well, next week you get to at least hear one. But I do appreciate the conversation and appreciate the amount of study and research that I am hearing here. So I have said my piece. I just really felt like there was a strong intention to stay within a particular tribal bloodline.
Thank you.
Brian, I would encourage you to answer David's question, because I remember in one of your books that you take the position that I think it's if only 10% marry out, then in 1,000 years, how many do you have left? It shows that it takes a very comparatively short time to dilute a bloodline, a tribal line. So yeah, if you care to give him accurate information on that, rather than what I'm faintly remembering after reading.
Okay, yeah, there was one appendix in that book that talked about how fast mixtures happen. I mean, if you take 10% of each generation, if only whatever group of people, whether it's the Hopis or a Jewish community in Europe or whatever group of people, if only 10% marry outside of the group each generation, in other words, 90% marry in the group, 10% marry out of the group, boy, it only takes about, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but only about 10 generations or maybe 15 or 20 of, and see, that's only, I mean, 10 generations is only like 300 years or 250, average of about 25 to 30 years per generation generally, but you'd have after, I can't remember what it is, 20 generations maybe, you have 1% still in the group, and 99% of the posterity of that group is outside of the group. And that's the situation for all such groups. So take the Hopi Reservation, for example. You have people on the Hopi Reservation and anywhere. You take any Native American group, and many of them have married outside the group. Sometimes in my classes, I have about half of the student body are Native American where I taught, and I'd ask the Navajos, how many of you know your 4 grandparents, and all 4 of them are Navajo, and hardly anybody would raise their hand. They say, okay, how many have other ethnic groups in your ancestry? And they'd all raise their hand, and I'd go through them and ask them, and some of them married a Maricopa from Arizona, or a Sioux from Montana, or a Mexican, or a Anglo from Ireland, or whatever. I mean, you get, and so, and that was not only now happens today, but that was always happening. You read through history of early histories of all the tribes, and usually the leader of the tribe was half of something else. And so this has been happening a lot, and so all of us are mixtures, and more thoroughly mixed than any of us know. I happen to be a 10th cousin of Barack Obama. Not that I'm claiming any fame with that, but that's what the relative finder told me. Anyway, yeah, so we are all thoroughly mixed with a lot of things that many of which we have no idea of. We did the DNA test on, we paid to have the DNA test done for my wife and myself and all of our children, and it was very interesting. My wife is about 1/3 Native American, but also Italian and Spanish. She's from Argentina, and yet she has more English ancestry than I do. I have a lot of West European and about half West European. Well, 95% of me is West European and Irish, but and it was only like 2% English, and she has like 6% English, and from all over the globe. I mean, lots of different ethnic groups in my children.
Yeah.
20 different ethnic groups in my children, and that's fairly typical for many people, if not most people.
Well, then, Brian, how is it that my father was declared a full-blood Okla Choctaw? Certainly, you're talking about recent times where there has been a lot of intermarriage because of the government boarding school and putting all the Indian children together. And so certainly in the recent years, 200 or 300 years, or 200 anyway, there has been the opportunity for intermarriage. But how is it then, how do you see that there are many who are declaring and seems to be full-blooded of that particular tribe or nation?
Yes, well, from a more present point of view, you know, if the last 3 or 4 generations that they know of were all Choctaw, then yeah, they could be considered 100% Choctaw in that sense. But they would have no idea of, you know, the dozens of generations above that. Since each generation above us doubles each generation, it only takes 10 generations and we have 1,000 ancestors. And 20 generations, we have over 1 million ancestral slots. Now that doesn't mean, you know, some of those are the same people. I mean, the same areas, same groups, they double up a lot. But in fact, in Europe, for example, you have 3 large entities, 3 large different ethnic groups. You have the Celtic people, who were all over Europe, basically probably the primary inhabitants of Europe from when known history began. And they the only Celtic languages that have survived are those in the British Isles of Old Irish and Scots Gaelic and Welsh. But they know that there are lots of others in the area. Then you have the Romans that conquered a lot of Europe and they mixed in with it. And then you have the Germanic peoples who started out in the north, but they spread everywhere over Europe. And you have the Visigoths. The Goths are a Germanic group. They conquered Spain at different times. They helped in the overthrow of Rome. So they were all over Europe also, as well as the English into the islands there, the British Isles. And so those 3 groups were everywhere and mixed thoroughly, such that geneticists, when they try to do genetic research in those areas, they can't really discern Celtic from Roman from Germanic. I mean, they're all so mixed that you know, they can get some ideas of some things, but it's a real mixture in Europe, and it would be the same thing in the Americas. I'm sure, you know, who can prove it? I don't know that, you know, it's like that friend of mine who I said, you know, you look Hopi to me. And I think I told you this in one of the presentations, and he got kind of frustrated and said, no, I'm 100% Navajo. Both my parents are native speakers and my grandparents, and you know, we're a whole family. We're 100% Navajo. I said, oh, okay. So we just dropped it. And a couple of years later, he came back and said, hey, you remember when you told me that I looked Hopi? Said, I just found out that 2 of my 8 great grandparents are Hopi. Okay, well, if that's the case for that generation, what about the generation before? I mean, the Hopis and the Navajos have been living next to each other for about 1,000 years, and they've done lots of mixing. In fact, the Navajo people, their genetic makeup is closer to their neighbors that they've lived next to than it is to the people who speak very closely related languages up in Canada and Alaska. So they've been mixing a lot, and mixing has been happening everywhere. I think, you know, occasionally there'll be a culture that's so adamant against it they can enforce it to a higher percentage, but there'll always be a few. But generally, mixing has been happening a lot everywhere, and so in the case of the Choctaw, and by the way, Choctaw are part of that Muskogean family that I was talking about. A good solid infusion of Lehite blood into there. Anyway, so yeah, you're right, and also everybody's a thorough mixture is also right, is how I'd have to sum it up.
Now, I found in this rather remarkable book, table number 1 on page 21 shows that if you have 10% of the population marrying outside, in 10 generations, you have 35% remaining in the group, and that gives you 65% outside. In 15 generations, you're down to 20% still in the group and 80% outside. And that strikes me as being particularly good, because this remarkable book is one that I read parts of to my wife while she was in the hospital, and she laughed, and now she's back to singing again. So thank you, Brian. I'm confident you helped to heal my wife. Now, that raises the other side of this issue, because she is one of those people that's almost a pure Polynesian, a pure Tahitian.
No.
But she had an English ancestor, John Hawkins. She had a German ancestor on her mother's side, Chair.
Yes.
And maybe there was a Spaniard back there. But then we got the 23andMe, and it shows.
All of them.
Speak up. What does it show?
Well, it showed that that I'm not the full Polynesian.
She had larger
35%.
35% Polynesian and larger percentage of Southeast Asian. Ah,
yeah. See, that's again, the Polynesians are mixtures. You have the Polynesian languages are related to the larger Austronesian language family out of Southeast Asia, but the DNA, modern DNA studies of the Polynesians show that they are a mixture of East and West. So they mainly came out of Southeast Asia, but the components have come from the Americas and mixed in, as well as some of the Aborigines of Australia. So they're actually at least a 3-way mixture, and you know, and it's like the oh, let's see, the French people. I mean, they're the Franks are Germanic, or they get their name French, and the language French is a descendant from Latin, from the Romans, and Gaul is in the middle of France, and then that's a Celtic name. So the French people are a thorough mixture of Celtic, Germanic, and Roman, and like most of us are thorough mixtures of anywhere from 6 to 12 different ethnic groups.
One more pushback here a little bit, if I can. My father, of course, went through the boarding school experience, and he speaks 5 languages. One of them is a foreign language he calls English. Yes, there's certainly the ability to be able to understand in a linguistic way what other tribal systems are saying. I'm just wondering, are we going to include the mixing of blood along with the mixing of the language?
Are we going to include it, you mean? I'm not sure the question.
I know that. I'm just wondering how that there's the suggestion of intermarriage, but Brian, your research is more in the language things and how there's similarities in the language. Is there research on the loss of the bloodline of tribalism?
I'm not sure what studies have been done on the bloodlines or DNA losses of tribalism, but now as far as languages are like people, they're mixtures. I mean, we mentioned how English is a mixture of several things, and most Native American languages are mixtures with whatever they live next to. And we showed in Uto-Aztecan that they're a mixture of Lehigh stuff and other things from the Americas. And Spanish has some Arabic in it and a lot of different things in it. So every language is a mixture as well. Just like
Yeah,
people.
and I don't know quite how to place this other than it just seems to me like it was so important to hold the culture and the heritage by having the same blood of a particular Indian nation. So intermarriage was greatly discouraged. That is in the old days.
Right. I have to plug my recharger in because I'm losing charge here. You're right. A lot of people strive for purity, and that's fine and good, and but seldom do they entirely succeed. And the reason is, for example, I have a strong Celtic component in my DNA, but I know nothing of bagpipes and kilts and so forth. So a lot of cultural things have been lost from my ancestors only, a couple of 100 years ago. And so, yeah, most cultures, they try to preserve it, but again, cultures are mixtures. I mean, you take the culture of the USA right now, it's a mixture of a lot of different things that came together from different directions. So in spite of the effort to maintain purity, it's a struggle, but some succeed better than others.
Yeah, I would have difficulties with the word purity as it is being able to transfer one's tribal culture to the next generation. And it seems to me like there was a lot of effort on the part of most native tribes to maintain that way of culture, that they didn't have the mixture of ceremonies. Certainly the Sundance was found in a number of traditions, but there was a great effort of holding to a particular tribal culture. I would dance around the idea of purity as it was being able to transfer the culture to the next generation.
Yes, and that's a very worthwhile effort. And like I say, some groups have succeeded fairly well. I'm mainly talking about incremental changes, even when we try to maintain, for example, trying to maintain the purity of a language, that works to a good degree. I mean, you look at the language change in 100 years and it's not that great, but there are some, and over 1,000 years, it would be greater. And so all of these efforts to maintain are good and fairly successful, but there's always certain amounts of change that kind of sneak in regardless of the best efforts.
Right, it's a lot shorter than that. I can't really understand my teenagers.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I give some attention to prophecy, yes, prophecy is going to indicate that once again, there's going to be a lot of company come to North America. And that is going to be another time of becoming really related because of the isolation that existed before. So it is a part of prophecy of intermarriage. I just would like to think that there is a little bit more effort on the part of tribalism to maintain a specific way of doing things called tradition and custom.
Yeah.
That's all I had to say right now.
Thank you, Rainbow. Thank you, Rainbow Eagle. I appreciate that answer. I am curious, however, you talk about the purity going, how far back do you go who is the one ancestor back there that starts your pure race? Or is there such a thing? If you have a single, all of a sudden we're dealing with incest. How does any tribe become pure? How far back do you go to find that a pure original ancestor?
Yeah, good question. In fact, you look at, I mean, the Israelites, for example, you've got the 12 sons of Jacob, and they married who knows whom, and then their kids married who knows whom. I mean, they weren't marrying cousins, or not all of them anyway, and so yeah, that again, mixtures from the very beginning. Jacob's grandchildren were 1/4 of Israel, and every generation thereafter became smaller percentages.
Of Israel.
Right, smaller percentages of Israel as they.
Sometimes they maintain that. For example, if you come from a royal family, and I'm just gonna point it out that in my family we had like 30 generations, and I mean they just, I think they had to marry within the group, because for them to maintain that, you don't want another blood to come in, that is not as you.
I'm listening to her, not you.
And I remember that is the case. Like, for example, people that have royal family and they keep their genealogy, where other people don't have that. That is a reason for that. That other people is not of the same, how would I say, same
Ethnic group.
If you are a royal family, you want to marry into a noble group and not somebody from the common, who are common people.
Well, what's interesting is that a lot of us have royalty in our ancestors. I mean, coming out of Europe, I mean, I go into a couple of different kings, and everybody I know who has really done their genealogy goes into royalty in a few lines. But see, that's exactly what we're talking about, is that when you tie into royalty at, say, 1000 AD or something, at that time you have millions of ancestral slots, many more that are not royalty. And of course, the one that is royalty means that they married somebody else that's not royalty. And so again, that royal line is very thoroughly diluted and mixed with everything else. And who's to say that the lower class folks they married weren't better than the kings and queens? A lot of wicked stuff happening among those kings and queens.
Also, royalty is the one that's kept historically. And so when you trace back through all your ancestors, yeah, you're almost bound to find somebody back there somewhere who's tied to royalty, because there's a record that says so, where all the rest of us don't see that.
Exactly. The royalty kept records better than the common folks. So exactly right.
Interesting, Mormon referred to himself as a pure descendant of Lehi, I mean, in the Book of Mormon.
And he might have been, I mean.
Yeah, I'm not saying exactly, but it's kind of like it was, it was like an anomaly, right? So that he point that out.
Yeah.
That could have been more of a philosophical descendant rather than a blood descendant, however.
And it might have been that as far as he knew, he might have other lines that he just didn't know about.
That's why I don't do genealogy. I keep finding people that were in prison and stuff. So.
Yeah, I consider some lines are royalty and others are ruralty, and I think the rural lines I liked better.
I even found some from Monticello and Blanding, which disturbed me a little bit.
Yeah, we've got Grovers down here in Blanding.
Yeah,
In
speaking of
fact,
polygamy,
In fact, that quarterback who took our team to the state championship, he's a Grover.
Yeah. Well, brothers and sisters, I'm going to have to leave. It's an hour difference and it's my bedtime. So thank you for letting me be a part of this. And
Thank you.
Perhaps I'll see some of you next week. See you all.
Good night, Rainbow Eagle.
Good night, you guys.
Question for Whitney. Whitney gave emphasis to Adam and Eve being married as a monogamous marriage, and also gave emphasis to them being side by side. Where did Adam get his wife?
You really want to go down that rabbit hole?
Well, I think I sent you a note out of my mom's book to offer a small indication, but I wanted.
Yeah, that was really fascinating. Thank you for sending that to me. Well, if we just stick with the scriptures, it just says she was taken out of Adam's rib. That's allegorical, of course. She was created in the image of God, is what we can safely say, and given to Adam, and the Lord said that he blessed them, and then they were commanded to multiply and replenish. So blessed would be the marriage ceremony, and then they were commanded to leave father and mother, or Adam was commanded to leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they were to become one flesh, which would be monogamy. And interestingly enough, as we're talking about, as Brian's been talking about genetics and marrying and whatnot, DNA, when you take the man's DNA and the woman's DNA, it creates a new person that is one flesh of mother and father. So that's also symbolic of that.
Didn't I hear you just say that Adam left his father and his mother?
Yeah.
That's a little bit difficult, a little bit like having George Washington be the first president of the United States in 1889, after the Declaration in 1876. Of 13 presidents before George Washington, he still gets to be the first one. I find history raised a lot of mystery. History.
Yes, it does.
Or 17.
17.
Yeah, 1789, 1776. Yeah, but there's a 13-year gap there before we get the first president. And so I'm wondering about the parentage of Adam, if, as you just indicated, he was to leave his father and his mother and cleave unto his wife, who was Eve.
You know, it would be interesting to know if in Adam's book of remembrance, if he has a better history of that. Those records were given to Abraham. Abraham was able to understand the records of his fathers, but those records, according to the traditions of the Jews, were destroyed by Joseph's brothers when they threw him in the pit. And so Moses is known as a great restorer of scripture. And that's why, starting the Bible, starting with Genesis, actually comes from it being revealed to Moses. So it would be very interesting if Adam actually had recorded his genealogy.
Well, and Frank refers to Adam's pre-Adamic compatriots. At Nauvoo, I have what I think is a very clear sequence of 10,000 years of artifacts.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it.
And I dug one of some of them.
Yeah, Rena uncovered a 5,000-year-old puppy dog.
Go
May
ahead,
I
Jan.
speak?
Go ahead, Jan.
I realize I'm sitting between a couple of brothers who have the same mother and father. That's
Yeah.
not funny.
as she sees the picture, that she sees the pictures on the screen. She's sitting between us. The rest of you may see it very differently.
All right. Well, there's room in our forum for scriptural orientations, scientific orientation, and all these perspectives coming together. And I really do appreciate that we've been maintaining an amicable approach to one another throughout our first year plus of forum discussions. And yes, there's plenty of room for disagreement, but what a marvelous thing to see the individual research that people are doing and bringing to the forum to share with us and give us a chance to ask questions and dig into it and see what we think. And particularly because Jerry has several books published that I'm anxious to get him to share his Swords of Shul and his geology of the Book of Mormon are, well, we've not had anything that's nearly as comprehensive as what he has done. And so I'd like to be able to get him on as soon as we can get him on the schedule for a couple of presentations on those topics. But you know, here we have Rainbow Eagle coming next week, Frank the week following, and we have the gentleman who's wanting to talk about biology, botany. What's his name? Kevin Price on the spotted bee balm. He really what he really wants to talk about is Zarahemla at Montrose, Iowa. But I got him on the topic of spotted bee balm as a possible medicinal plant of the Nephites, and he wants to put it there for us. But you'll notice that we've got several people with different places for where the land or city of Zarahemla must have been. So there will be room for disagreement there. And then we have Larry Bryant coming back, and Ed Fonts, Boyd Tuttle, and Robin Jensen, and David Reed all in the next segment. So it's just a fascinating thing to see the remarkable research and depth and breadth of research that goes into these presentations. And so I appreciate so deeply that here we are, 10, almost quarter to 11 again. And we still have a 20 of you wanting to talk. Frank still has his hand up, so let him go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to express my appreciation for what you've done, Paul, in putting this group together and allowing us all to share our opinions. And we all have opinions, you know, if we didn't, we'd be the same person.
I don't remember that we ever agreed before, did we?
Well, you know, I knew Paul way many years ago. The only people who know you more than I do here are your brothers. And yeah, we talked a lot, and I really enjoyed that.
Well, even when we hitchhiked to Mexico together, we disagreed on the rides we should take and the route we should take.
Yeah. One night we spent under a bridge down there in Texas.
Yeah, sleeping on concrete was not much fun. I didn't want to do that again.
I'll never forget that, you know, we got on the freeway. My mom and dad dropped us off out there on what was 71 bypass, I think. And we had a ride that took us halfway there before my mom and dad left. It was quite an adventure. Anyway, but I wanted to just say, you know, my belief, my opinion is that we rely on that which is written. So I believe that the historical evidence that we have is the most valuable for us. And the things that we extrapolate from science, and I love science. I was a science teacher, remember. I love it. I loved it all my life. But I know that there's a difference between what can be extrapolated by science and what my grandmother told me, for example. You know, I trust my grandmother's word far above something that we might find out of probability.
Well, Frank wants to trust the written record, and I don't trust historians much farther than I can throw them. It seems to me that historians almost always are writing the story for their audience, And therefore, you can count on the history to be more story than fact. And as I've been working on the Mansion House story, for example, to find the same event is in three different documents in 3 different locations within the Mansion House. It makes it so that you can't really trust any of the location documents because you don't know which ones to trust.
Well, when I said the written word, I'm talking about.
It was a
scripture, not-
trust.
I agree with you. Historical stuff is being written as we're talking right now
Well,
and changed.
I look at the artifacts, and the artifacts tell the truth. They tell the story of their own background, their own existence. And if you can ferret out the truth from the story of the artifacts, I think you have a much more reliable account than you do if you're simply taking the written word.
I'm waiting for the brass plates.
And the brass
Having worked with
plates.
Paul and Nauvoo a number of summers, I also recognize, however, you have to identify that artifact accurately. And if you misidentify the artifact, you're no better off than the historians.
That's right.
That's right.
Well, a lot of archaeologists have a lot of imagination too, I've found.
Well, that's just like guides in Mexico.
Yes, the archaeologists often have an audience. Sometimes people that are paying them. I'm not gonna add that, but
They play to those who pay.
right. So there's a comparable problem.
I'm just kidding.
But it's true anyway, right?
There's just an awful lot of ceremonial artifacts that are ceremonial because the archaeologist doesn't know what they are.
Right.
True. I'm going to sign off. God bless you all. Appreciate again what you all have done.
I should probably fix dinner for my wife.
No, why?
No, why?
You're not going to sing us off tonight?
Save that for tomorrow.
Okay.
Good night, the Lord is watching o'er you. Good night, his blessings go before you. Good night, and we'll be praying for you. So good night, may God bless you.
Good night.
And God bless you. Bye.
And thank you all. Thank you for sharing so late.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Yes, happy Thanksgiving. Good idea.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving. That's right. And what do they don't celebrate Thanksgiving in